Hello and welcome to Newsclick. The government recently declared that anyone earning over Rs 27 in rural India and over Rs 33 in urban India was to be considered as living above the poverty line. Various politicians have taken this a step further and suggested that it's perfectly easy to get a meal for as little as Rs 5 or Rs 12. To discuss what these figures mean and their economic impact, we have with us today Dr. Smitha Gupta, Economist at the Institute of Human Development. Hi Smitha, and thanks for joining us today. Now, the official poverty rates used household expenditure as a measure of how rich or poor a family is. I understand that this survey primarily accounts for calorie consumption adjusted for inflation over time. Do you believe that this is a good or economically sound method of measurement, given in particular the fact that household expenditure may not adequately mirror the consumption of food and also the absence of human development indicators in this index?
I think prior to asking whether this is a good or a bad indicator, let's understand what the indicator is, because there's a lot of obfuscation which goes on. In 1973, the Planning Commission accepted a methodology based on the twin criteria, separately for urban and rural areas, of calorie intake, where they said that 2400 calories per person in rural areas and 2100 calories per person in urban areas is what is required to keep a person out of poverty. Therefore, they looked at the consumption, expenditure and consumption patterns. By pattern, I mean the basket of commodities that is consumed per household in the NSS data, to see at what level of income can households, after they meet their non-food requirements, actually meet this food consumption requirement. Now, the non-food requirements, as you know, would include manufactured goods, they would include utilities, rent, health, education and so on. So, in 73, they actually found that it was Rs 56 for rural areas, for urban areas, and 49 for rural areas. At that time, the calorie line was based, the poverty line was based entirely on the calorie content of this line. And the definition was the level of income at which a person can consume more than 2400 calories in rural and 2100 in urban areas. But after that, all that they did was use the price index to upgrade this line. So after that, there was no reference to standard of living. The question asked was not that at what level of expenditure will the same standard of living be maintained to stay out of poverty. The question really was, what is Rs 56 of 1973 equal to today? So it was just an indexation of the 1973 line. This has three problems. One is that the basket of commodities is assumed to be the same now too, which is 40 years hence. So the problem is, number one, that the basket of commodities has changed, and this does not capture that. And secondly, all our incomes have increased far more than the price index.
Right.
For example, as Utsa Patnaik argues, 1000 rupees then is equal to 18,000 rupees now using only the price index. 1000 rupees is what a senior government official was getting then, but they're not getting 18,000 today. They're getting 70,000 today at the same level. So therefore, clearly the basket of commodities has changed, the standard of living has changed, but to maintain the same standard of living, there are many other factors which come into play.
Now, what is this poverty line statistic actually used for? I mean, there's been some confusion over whether this statistic actually affects the number of beneficiaries under central government schemes and so on. Do you believe that the government is actually guilty of using double standards? I mean, on the one hand, saying that these statistics are purely to measure trends, but on the other hand, actually using it to work out subsidy allocations and so on?
See, I wish the whole discussion was purely an academic one about what has been the trend over time in a certain number. It isn't. It has very, very important implications for people's well-being, because it means that your access to so many government schemes and welfare programs would depend on whether you're poor or non-poor. So when the government fixes a number, then only that many people will have access. But the government itself is not very convinced by its own 22% estimate. Why else would they have a food security bill with 67%? So the government itself knows it's wrong, so they do double speak. At one point they say, no, this is purely an academic exercise, it has no implications for policy. On the other hand, so many schemes of the government depend on your having this BPL card or not. To this, I want to add another dimension to this whole discussion, which you raised earlier, the question of human development. See, why is there this outrage when you look at this number? Number one, because it's so low. I mean, 33 rupees and 27 rupees is laughable. But the outrage is also because it's so unbelievable that we have reduced poverty, that we've pulled out 138 million people from poverty in this 7-year period. That's what they're saying, right? They're saying 138 million people have been pulled out of poverty in 7 years, and much of this in the last 2 years alone. So the rate of decline has been an average of 2.2% per year. And yet, look at other things. For example, you look at anemia. Anemic children continue to be at about 75%, women at 50%, low birth weight babies at about 30%, chronic energy deficiency is about 1/3 of the Indian population, and so on. So therefore, the whole idea that poverty is coming down at a time when every other indicator of well-being, of health, of nutrition is doing so badly is itself unbelievable.
So, which actually leads me, nicely to my next question. I mean, isn't there a recognized global standard to judge what is or what constitutes poor or poverty? I mean, I understand, for instance, at the World Bank, they use an extreme poverty line of $1.25, which is adjusted for purchasing power parity. On what is this based, and why isn't this just used the world over? I mean, or similar standards?
You know, at $1.25 or even dollar, where are we today? 62 rupees? Yeah. Well, then 62 rupees is what about 10% of our population spends. So in the Indian case, if we use an estimate like that, then of course we have mass poverty. But that's not the point. I think every state, forget about every country, has its own specificities. It has its own prices, it has its own consumption patterns. So I'm not really a great votary of having a universal poverty line across the globe and even across the country. So, I mean, you can, for the sake of debate, for the sake of a comparison, you can do that. But that's not something which I think is the path to go. I think the path to go is actually to ensure that food and nutrition remains a central part of any definition of poverty, and add to that other non-food expenditure, for example, health, education, shelter, transport, utilities like power, etc., sanitation, water. So, if you have a basket of this kind and then you can give it a number, it's not difficult to do. Let me just tell you that in the NSS data itself, you can actually read at what level of monthly per capita expenditure do you have your 2100 and 2400 calories. You can read it. And if you read it, for example, for 2004-05, you find that something like 70% of rural households and 65% of urban households were not getting the minimum calorie requirement. Now you come to 2009-10, it actually worsened. And you found that 75% of rural households and 73% of urban households were not getting their minimum calorie requirement. So we actually don't need to, spend too much time in devise. It's good to devise a better indicator. But even the existing 1973 definition of the Planning Commission itself, if they use it with the existing database, they can actually arrive at a poverty line. But they don't want to do that because then they can't show that the UPA government has brought down this.
The government has announced that poverty in India has declined tremendously from 37% in 2005 to 22% last year or the year before. Now, you clearly don't agree with this assessment based on what you've just said, but could you just explain further why you think that the current methodology produces or does not produce a realistic portrayal of poverty in India? I mean, other than the fact that it's, of course, fairly simplistic?
Well, the reason, as I said earlier, is that there is no direct reading of people's consumption patterns.
When you say they don't read that directly?
What I mean is that you can see in the data at what level of expenditure for different deciles of the population, whether you want to do income distribution or you want to do it on the basis of land ownership or any criteria that you use. But you can use expenditure criteria themselves. So the bottom 10% in expenditure, the next 10%, the next 10%. So you take 10 deciles. For each decile, you can actually read at what level of expenditure do they meet or do they not meet their calorie requirement. So it's not difficult at all.
Why do you believe, I mean, if you were to go by the government figures at least, there's been a huge change in poverty statistics. And now why do you think that this is, I mean, if you again were to believe their figures, why do you think this has happened? Is this just tinkering with the indicators? Is this because of social schemes like Narega? Or is this actually an effect of the booming Indian economy in the late 90s and early 2000s trickling down to the masses?
Actually, what has happened? What has happened is that the monthly per capita expenditure across deciles has gone up, right? This is being used as the basis for arguing that poverty has come down. But why has expenditure come down, and does that give us cause to celebrate? It would had people's standard of living improved. But what do we find? What has happened in the same period? There's been very high food price inflation, very high. There's been a declining trend in employment growth. In this very period, you find that all utilities and public services are getting increasingly privatized and becoming more costly and out of reach. So therefore, the non-food component of expenditure of households has become quite significant in terms of its burden on the household budget. And so, while the government is correct in saying that monthly per capita expenditure has grown, from this to deduce that standard of living has improved or poverty has come down is erroneous.
As you've mentioned, I mean, there's been a number of indicators in which India is doing incredibly badly, human development indicators in particular. So how do you square these positions given the fact that you have, as you also say, there has been such an increase in national consumption or in spending patterns? So how do you square the fact that you have a set of people in India who are getting richer and richer, but at the same time it appears that these benefits are not actually reaching the vast majority of people in rural India?
You know, there is a deep polarization. When the monthly per capita expenditure of the poor goes up, it's absorbed in higher costs for the same thing. So they consume less and less, so it's not higher consumption. It is higher expenditure, but lower consumption, greater deprivation, and a far lower standard of living. That's what's happening for the poor. It's only at the upper end, because of, as you said, rising inequality, that higher consumption in terms of higher goods being consumed, that takes place. So at the lower end, you have prices and higher costs which absorb much of the high expenditure which the poor are incurring. So you have this dichotomy of growing expenditure and worsening standard of living, higher deprivation, greater malnutrition, worsening health statistics.
Now, even though states are free to set their own measures of poverty, very few have actually done so. I mean, Kerala is an obvious example. Why is this? I mean, why are state governments so eager to just use whatever data central government is sticking by?
To put it in another way, what you're asking me is, why are centrally determined poverty estimates so sticky, exactly, right? Yes. Now, the reason that happens is because much of the centrally funded schemes and the centrally funded programs are allocated by the Planning Commission and by different ministries on the basis of need, and need is determined by poverty. So when you target public programs, when you target government schemes, then clearly those states will only get the money in proportion to their poor. And any further expenditure that they want to do, which they are doing. Tamil Nadu, look at Tamil Nadu's near universal food security scheme, for example, they're doing it. But the allocations from the center are done on the basis of the centrally determined poverty estimates. And so for the states to have their own poverty estimates doesn't make any sense from the point of view of central allocation. But the states have been demanding for long that let us identify the poor and let us have the criteria and let us tell you that in our state we have so many poor. But they don't allow it at the central level. They say, no, we will tell you that you have 10% poor.
Now, given that it appears anyway that the government's bluff has been called on these figures that they've announced, why do you think that they actually came up and announced these figures with so much fanfare? I mean, in particular, given in urban areas you have rising inflation, at the same time you have the Rangarajan Committee, which is actually looking at reformulating your methodology to calculate the poverty line. So what was the hurry with this? Is it just because we have elections around the corner in another year?
Well, you know, it's interesting for you to know that since 1970, the large sample has been done by NSS every 5 years. This is for the first time that within 2 years, they had another very large sample. Why? Because they wanted to ensure that the 2004-05 period up to the 2009-10 period, 10-11 period, was coterminous with the tenure of the UPA government. It's no surprise, therefore, that you have this massive, unprecedented poverty reduction in this period, 15.3 percentage points. So the whole idea of doing this large round was in any case to tom-tom the achievement of the government And the reason why they jumped the gun and did not wait for Rangarajan committee, because that would come in 2014 election year. So the whole political benefit which they think they will get from trying to say that there's been 2.2% reduction per annum in the UPA regime of poverty, they will not be able to get after 2014. So that's the undue haste with which they brought it out that explains that. And the reason why they did another very large round, again, is the same. They don't want to wait because the next large round is again 2014-15. So that doesn't help them.
Well, thank you so much, Smitha, for being with us today. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Thank you.